You're watching the Hostile Takeover podcast.
An experience that was beyond narrative, beyond historical context. It was an expression of love for obviously one of the world's most loved artists. It was an abstract piece of music and film all around you that captured you emotionally. And yes, we spent a very large amount of money on production to make that happen, but it was all in service to this creative, piece of work, without the limitation, I guess, of it being, oh, it must have a story, it must have all these things. And I think because it was such an emotional experience, it was successful during that pandemic, at that moment when people just needed something without being told how to feel, they just felt.
Yeah. Hey, Sean, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good, thanks. It's great to see you. It's been a while.
It has. Nice to see your beard.
Yeah. Likewise, you've been growing one in too.
Well, it gets longer and shorter depending on how much work I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, and you've been doing a lot of work. This Immersive Van Gogh project that you've got yourself in has been massive over the past couple years and just growing. But we'll get to that a bit later. Maybe tell the viewers a little bit about yourself, how you got started in the industry.
Well, I mean, I've been doing this a while. I'm 56 this year, but I started out, I guess, as an audio engineer. I started out as a musician originally, but I got into audio engineering quite early on. Very late 80s, in the Toronto music scene, doing all the clubs and stuff, getting to know all the indie bands at the time. At some crucial moment in the early mid 90s, I started touring with bands, and I guess the career split slightly when I went out on the road, and as what happens with a lot of Canadian production staff, they distances are long and crew needs are different than in other countries. And the first thing someone said was, well, hey, can you drive, or can you do something? What else can you do besides be a sound engineer? And I was so keen to do that work that I said, yeah, I'll do whatever you want. Which began this long slide, either downhill or uphill, depending on how you look at it.
I like every person I talk to, and myself included, we all say, like, you have to wear so many hats in Canada, just like you said, like be a driver, a audio engineer, a merch person, a tour manager, or all of those things in one.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I used to be a house tech years ago at a place called the Horseshoe Tavern, and I do remember very clearly there being some fairly well-known UK artists that would come through, and they do some showcase there where it was, they were big enough in their country that they had a full crew and whatnot, but they'd show up to a Horseshoe gig and they'd have 9 people working as crew for them or something. They had a backline guy for everyone on the stage, and I was just blown away by this, because any work that I'd seen people do, this is before I started touring really, they had a driver, tour manager, they had a tour manager, sound person, they had 2 people in the van with the band. And I had a bit of a chuckle about that at the time. But long story short, I started doing a bit of touring. The first band I properly toured with, I guess, was this band called Change of Heart. We got down into the States, and it was trial by fire. Can you count money? Can you keep track of receipts? Can you drive a car to Florida in 14 hours? And I somehow passed that what do you call it, trial by fire, and I guess in a way the rest is history. I just kept doing it, and so I started doing more and more touring work, and I took on more and more of the responsibilities of just not just being a sound engineer. And of course, I was interested in the sound engineering side of it, but I just had this sort of interest to stay busy.
Yeah.
Maybe my brain was always kind of going a mile a minute, and I was wanting to learn. And I think at some point, I really, truly kind of realized that I was more interested in the technology side of it, in the nuts and bolts of what makes a production work, than in, for lack of a better word, babysitting. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
the human, care side of it. Not that I didn't care or have empathy for people. It's just that wasn't where I was drawn to, the way some people might be. And some people are fantastic at that work, and I just found myself more increasingly interested in sort of what makes a show click, and less interested in the artist's day-to-day needs. And so when my tours were successful, from my point of view, was when I had artists that could work well within sort of a universe where they took care of themselves for the most part, and I took care of their grander needs, and we focused on a great production. And we had some great runs. I had some awesome artists that I worked with over the years, and I just kind of kept getting kind of bigger and bigger tours and gigs. Not too many ups and downs, like real downs, but at some point, like anybody, I thought I really need to level up and sort of start doing not just club dates across, the States or across Canada. I wanted to do bigger shows, and that led me to starting to work at home. When I was in town, I started working for a couple of production companies. I worked for Westbury National for a while, and I also at some point ended up working sort of an offshoot of Westbury Nationals. Ended up starting working for Clare Brothers. Clare Brothers Canada. The early version of that wasn't Clare Brothers, but we became partners. I worked with a guy named Steve Towers, and that group of folks, and that was really great for me, in the sense that I kind of got into the nuts and bolts of production without it being on tour, production at a much larger scale, doing either festivals or arena shows or corporate events, that kind of thing. And I learned an awful lot from that, and I got to really dig into both being a more higher level audio person, but also, because I was being asked to be at times an account manager and other type roles, I got to put my finger into certain positions that I think I was trying on for size more than anything else, and funnily enough, parallel to all that, one of the key career gigs that didn't present itself originally as I didn't think of it as much initially, but it ended up being a very long running sort of year in, repeating gig every summer, was a festival called North by Northeast. And that is very loosely sort of a sister festival to South by Southwest. They had original roots, were similar and crossed over with each other, but of course it ran its own course and whatnot. But I got involved very early on, a couple of years into it, and it was handed over to me by a couple of very talented individuals who just didn't want to continue doing it. But the first year I did it, it was literally me in a cube van with a couple of people running around dropping off some gear to people. And
I did a similar festival, Canadian Indie Week, and it's the same thing. There's like 40 venues across the city, and trucks full of backline and shooting stuff everywhere, like 200 bands. It's a really interesting production when like, logistically speaking, to do something like that, especially with a small team like you had. It's a lot to cover.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, the most interesting thing I took away from it was that every year it got slightly bigger.
Mhm.
Every year it got a slightly more, ambitious.
Mhm.
And it was very incremental. It was truly every year, tiny bit more every year. And I got to sort of um, build systems that no one had built before.
Mhm.
And I was working somewhat in a vacuum, and that was very fascinating for me. And we were able to sort of build bespoke ways of organizing things and doing stuff because it was not unique to the world. There were other festivals doing it, but we weren't going to conferences and talking about how we did things. We were just saying, here's the new additional challenge for the year. Let's see how we can do it. And we had a really interesting group of people we worked with over the years. And I brought in a team of people that came in regularly. But by the end of it, I think the last couple of years we had something in the range of 900 bands. So
Wow.
it became quite a monster,
Yeah.
and it was really a growth experience for me. But this was all parallel to my touring life and all
Yeah.
the other things I was doing, because I would kind of do it for 5 or 6 weeks every year, and the rest of the year I could do whatever I wanted. Um, but eventually, I got away from the tour managing. I got much more into production and corporate and live, bigger productions,
Yeah.
and I was able to be just a production manager in a number of instances. Um, and I think it was a good moment for me when I was able to create scenarios that when I was hired as an audio engineer, that's what I did, and that's all I did. And when I was hired as a production manager, I was okay with just letting a talented person
Yeah.
do a job that I knew how to do, but I didn't need to do this time around. And I got some really great opportunities through that. Got to work with some pretty great artists over the years, and it kept it fresh and interesting for me. I think the most important thing for me through all of these years of working, and I'm over 30 years in the industry now, is I've rarely done the same thing twice, exactly the same way,
Yeah.
and going to new countries that I've never been to before, going to, working with genres of music or new levels of challenge as a production, whether it's, again, artist or corporate, all of that is what's kept me kind of seeking, I guess. And I think in particular on the production side, um, I, I didn't get into this when I was 20 because I wanted to be a production manager. I got into this because I was interested in music and in art and creativity.
Mhm.
And so I think one of the driving forces for me as a production individual has always been about finding something creative within the production side of it. What is it that I'm learning, and what new challenges do I have? Because without that, it would feel like I'm kind of selling my soul,
Yeah.
for lack of a better
Yeah.
description, because I want to feel connected to the work of art, whatever that is, and I want to feel that if I'm doing something on the production side, it's creative on some level, but also connecting back to the creative
Yeah.
from another point of view.
Yeah.
And so that's always been a really, really primary motivator for me. And so it's brought on all these new challenges. And at some point, someone said, "Hey, can you do some musical theater?" And I went, "Well, I've never done that before. That sounds
Of course I
absolutely
can.
crazy." But, of course, I said yes. And at first, it was me consulting with well, it ended up being the person I'm working with now. But my first consultation with them was me living in the UK at the time, essentially telling them how to tour a theater production like a rock and roll tour,
Yep.
meaning we're going to go in a truck, we're going to make it happen on a day-to-day basis, and they're going to build a show and then be on the highway by 1 a.m. for the next city, and to show theater people that it can be done that way, because I had done years and years of this on the rock and roll side. And at first it was consulting, and then at some point I got sort of dragged into doing a couple of theater tours. But again, that was because it was a challenge. I'd never done theater before. I'd never worked with theater
Yep.
folks before. Um, and I saw it as a positive experience for me, even if I chose not to do it more than twice, I think, because I was learning something. And I think that's the key there. What am I learning? What am I, growing from? What can I use that to fold into the next experience? And I think ultimately that's what led me to doing this gallery thing, was because I'd done a bunch of festival work and because I'd done some theatrical work. I was originally called to work on this Banksy show, and it was, for me, the challenge at the time was there are city planners, there are architects involved, there are permitting involved, a whole bunch of things that I knew something about, and I had done some work with. Certainly from the festival side of it, I'd certainly done a bunch of that coordination. I'd worked with Luminato, I'd worked on North by Northeast, especially with Young Dundas Square and all those types of things. But I mean, having an architect in the room and engineers in the room was in a sense a brand new challenge for me, and so that was for me a new thing to learn. Again, I can production manage this, but this is a project in a much broader sense, and so I got involved in that.
So
and
just for the listeners there, so you're working on Immersive Van Gogh, which is a giant immersive art experience that has multiple venues all across North America, and it all kind of started or stemmed from this Banksy exhibit in Toronto, which was, I believe, the first one that Lighthouse had put on. So just the scope of that kind of project it's much different from a show, because you're dealing with all of these city planners and engineers as a permanent install, as opposed to just a temporary install, which has just a whole different set of regulations, rules, bylaws, state laws or provincial laws. So it's just a much different scope than 90% of the people in the events industry just aren't ever dealing with. So I just wanted to kind of like expand that so we can understand what you're talking about when you're talking about this level of planning.
I think the two things that are the one area that it crosses over is that there are some temporary elements to a show like that, that you need to educate the people that think of taking over buildings as what would normally be permanent, and coming at it from a bunch of years of production experience. You can explain to someone, well, that can slip through as temporary because we are really kind of temporary, but we'll be here for a year. And I'd done a number of those already. With the Banksy show, we went into a raw space that needed a bunch of renovation, that needed a bunch of upgrades to make it fire code acceptable for public assembly and those types of things, and that involved architects, and that involved people that wouldn't normally touch event planning, because typically you go into an event space and it's already an event space. It is ready to go with the with the exits in the right place and the fire extinguishers already installed and the sprinklers and all that. But none of that was installed in this place. It was a raw, gorgeous but raw space that we had to convert, and with fairly little help from the landlord at the time. He just like, here it is, and we had to turn it into something. And for me, that was a really interesting and amazing challenge, and I think I rose to it, and we opened a ultimately very successful show. It wasn't an immersive gallery in an AV sense. It was really just an art gallery with but that was wonderful. And then once it was open, the doors were wide open, I was able to move on to other gigs, which was also really wonderful. I build things, I don't operate them necessarily. Right? So
that Banksy exhibit, it kind of time-stamped just a way of people experiencing events where it changed from kind of going to just a show or a conference or something, and it just kind of gave people more of like so it wasn't quite as immersive as say the Immersive Van Gogh project you're working on now is, but it
Mhm.
was like a space that was at least a bit interactive where people were like taking photos with the scenery, and like that was all part of the whole design of it, was to have that kind of guerrilla marketing pushed into it, and that's why a lot of these things like Banksy exhibit kind of became so successful.
I think that's true. I think that's true. And one of the crucial elements to make a show like that viable for a producer, in part, is finding that sweet spot in terms of real estate, where you're working in potentially a raw industrial neighborhood, but it's on the very verge of being gentrified. It's about to turn over into something where you couldn't afford to do anything but build offices,
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
yeah,
And in this instance, that is exactly where we were at. Right across the street, there was a massive, well government funded up to yin yang, art gallery being built at an incredible cost, which we couldn't compete with. But they weren't open yet; they were being built. It was, that kind of thing. But 5, 6 years later, you go to that neighborhood and it is amazing what they've done in that area. We'd have to move 3, 4 miles out of the city to do what we did there.
yeah,
But I think in a way, Banksy was the perfect symbol of being able to take over spaces like that at that sweet spot in time, but also in location where, it's not quite turned over to the the folks that
yeah,
want to make a huge profit, but it's the developers and whatnot. But at the same time, it's yeah. So for me, that was also an interesting component to this.
yeah,
We ended up taking that show to Miami, and it was intended to tour. It didn't end up touring; it ended up being a two-show location from my point of view, and then it sort of got paused for a little while. But we had exactly the same experience in Miami. We took over a building in an area that was very, very similar to the original space in Toronto, where right on the edge of things,
yeah,
right on the verge of things. And that, again, I think that for me is also, again, part of this challenge. I don't think I've ever uh, colored inside the lines, whether it's a career move or an artistic move or anything to that effect. I've always found artists that speak to me creatively, and I try and see a way to make it work as a product that you know translates to a big enough audience that we can justify doing really, really big things. And I think in a sense those two gallery experiences were very similar from a lot of the things I've done in the past, with slightly more underground outside kinds of shows and exhibits and things like that, because like I said, it's a scrappy but ambitious type experience, and I think I always relate to the scrappy side of things. So.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about kind of the gentrification of neighborhoods, and putting on like a cool piece of culture in an area, and like it happens with say like Banksy, and it kind of draws people in, and maybe a coffee shop opens up, and then it just kind of becomes a cool little hub. And it's just the same with anywhere, where there was like cool, like if you look at like Queen Street in Toronto, for instance, like in
Mhm.
uh, like that area, was once a hub for creative and arts, and now, you know, as more things go in there, the more money it generates, the more condos go in, and the more like that kind of thing goes in, and it kind of like kills the neighborhood. So art and property is always kind of like, like had this like balancing act of like kind of like zigzagging out of these places when they become too expensive, and finding new
Mhm.
homes. It's yeah, it's really interesting because you see it all the time, and like every city you go to, there's a little a little hub somewhere tucked away. and
Yeah,
it only lasts a
it's
brief
funny.
period of time.
Yeah, I mean, what's really funny about that also is that I believe that the people that produced the Banksy show thought they understood who the market was, and they may have been slightly wrong. But what the interesting result of that was is that they took a property that made sense to them financially, but also in this funny little sweet spot. But I also believe that they believed that their primary attendance audience was going to be the urban downtown
Hmm.
audience that would ride their bicycles to this gig.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that ended up being the exact opposite. Or like, I don't have anything to do with marketing. I don't know much about operations, but I do know that one of the big surprises for them was that they were getting people from 30 miles north and west and east, and I can't go 30 miles south in Toronto, but
Yeah.
the Brampton and the Uxbridge and the suburbanites essentially were coming to a part of Toronto that they'd never come to or would have no reason to
Yeah.
even know about. And so most of the revenue generated in this gallery were from people way outside the demographic that would hop on a bicycle and just go to this show that's in a cool neighborhood. So in a way, we can maybe, like, you could have a long conversation about what that did to bring life to a neighborhood that maybe didn't have life beforehand.
Yeah.
And
Well,
and
for,
so
for
I think
sure, what was it up on, like Dundas, which is like north of the hub, the entertainment hub. Anyways, was it Dundas? I think it
absolutely,
was. Yeah.
absolutely, it was on Sterling. It was on Sterling,
Yeah.
just across from the chocolate, the Cadbury's chocolate
Yeah.
factory or whatnot.
Yeah.
Um,
Definitely out of the way
but
though from the hub of
Yeah, no,
entertainment in
absolutely.
Toronto.
And so, but yeah, they really thought they were bringing in these people who are just down on Queen Street or just west on in Hyde Park or something. And excuse me, ultimately that of course those came, but the majority of people came from outside, of the core.
Yeah.
And so we brought some much needed love to the area that I think is really interesting in Toronto.
Yeah.
So
It's
that was
really
that.
interesting about just the demographic of it as well. Like Banksy's always been kind of you know, not say he's pretty popular, but I wouldn't say mainstream artist. He's always been kind of
Hmm.
counterculture and underground, and to see families making the trip from suburbia to Toronto is pretty interesting. So it became
Yeah.
kind of a destination.
Yeah, well, I just build them, but
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
fascinating to see what
It
happens.
is
Yes,
for sure,
exactly.
for sure.
Yeah. Mhm.
So you touched a little bit about the kind of speed that these things came. You had with the Banksy, you had another gallery opening up right across the road, so you kind of had to get it in motion quickly. And
Mhm.
Immersive Van Gogh started out in the pandemic,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then now you're up to 22 venues, I believe. Am I right? Maybe more?
We have opened and closed a couple
Okay.
because one or two of them were always designed to be temporary spaces.
Hmm.
But yes, we've opened 22, and we currently sit comfortably, I think, at 17.
Okay.
In terms of still open, still operating, but that was by design, not
Yeah.
by failure.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
but
yeah,
17's a lot. Let me
it's
tell
a
you.
lot. It's a lot. And I don't think a lot of people understand the kind of scope of it. A lot of people kind of stay close to home, so they'll hear of a Van Gogh exhibit in New York or Toronto or something, and they think that's it. But Lighthouse Immersive managed to open up over, well, 17 permanent now, but over that in a matter of a couple of years. And
Hmm. Hmm.
they not only managed to open up that many, but they managed to open up the best and the biggest and the most well put together creatively, in my opinion. I brought up some examples we can show when we get there, but talk a little bit about the whirlwind of going from doing Banksy to opening one venue up in Toronto, where the Immersive Van Gogh started, to now being company
A
that
juggernaut?
has a juggernaut, with ties with the Walt Disney Corporation, and just give us a little bit about that trajectory and how, like, your experience
Yeah,
in it.
yeah. Well, so I was initially brought in, similar to the Banksy exhibits, as a project manager who was going to build one gallery. There was no global domination plan in place when we talked about doing this cool, Van Gogh exhibit. We looked at a couple of raw industrial spaces in Toronto, late 2019. Landed on a place. The address ended up being 1 Yonge Street, which is the old Toronto Star building, and they had a what used to be the printing facility there. And for us, it was perfect. No windows, lots of high ceilings, and lots of raw walls. It just couldn't have been more perfect. From a we didn't have to do anything. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, we signed a lease late January, or very close to that. And of course, we didn't know what was coming up in a couple of months, but we got cracking with designing this. Of course, at the time, we were in partnership with the Italian content creators who did an awful lot of the technical sort of input and supervision on what their version of an immersive experience would be from from the projection standpoint. But it was a complete construction build out, because we needed to create the gallery within a 50,000 square foot space. We had to build walls that were 45 feet high. There was all these engineering challenges. All of that I took on as a project. Of course, lots of other team members involved in that, but we ended up using the same engineers and architectural people that we worked on in the Toronto Banksy, which was a big, easy handover to have them work on it with us. And then the pandemic hit, and of course we were kind of stuck in this really funny, dark middle ground where the whole industry had shut down. We were all just losing, and like, what do we do? This is crazy. Of course, we could go on and sort of on and on about that. And of course, the producers of this one show, at the time it was meant to be one show, they were kind of in for a penny, in for a pound. They had no choice but to say, well, we got to go through with this. We got to push this through, because they'd invested all of their potential into this experience that was at risk of just going nowhere, everyone going bankrupt. And so they found the means to push through and get this thing open. And then the challenge came to me, which was, how do you do this in a pandemic? How do I, build or put production people safely into a room? I mean, we're talking March 2020, and there were no protocols for this yet.
No,
the film industry was still shut down. Everybody was sitting at home, afraid to go out, but all the production staff in Toronto hadn't had work in, at that point, a couple of months. And March and April, May, there was the time that we were looking at all this. And I will honestly credit something like my experience from a North by Northeast type scenario, where I didn't have a rule book and I made something happen. And every year I had to write some new rules. And I called up a few trusted people, labor suppliers and production people, companies, vendors, and I said, okay, we can't do this the way we normally do this, but if you support me, we can do this safely. We can get everybody in. We can work, and we need to find a different way of working.
Yeah.
And so we developed a system that was safer, smarter, and we just executed with the best knowledge we knew how to. And we got the show built. We got it in there. We got it up. And there were a couple of slightly hilarious delays, because the Ontario government was, the goalposts were changing every couple of weeks. And of course, one of the somewhat, hilarious but very interesting moments happened from a marketing, but also a production standpoint, was one of our producers realized that we were driving into this venue to park, because downtown Toronto is so expensive. It's $22 to park on the street or in a parking lot, even during a pandemic. And so we were driving up this ramp in the loading dock and parking inside the venue because it was basically a construction site. And he came in one day with his car and he looked around and he realized, oh, there's 14 cars in here. And he's like, why don't we just do it as a drive-in?
Yeah.
And light bulb went off in his head. He clearly saw the posters and the banners and the ads that followed, because he's a marketing genius. But we called the city, we called all the people, again, back to the city planners and all the people that we already knew. And they were like, there's nothing stopping you as long as the cars aren't running, we're fine. So questions went out and we came up with a way to do this as a drive-in. And it bypassed the problem, which was, how do we get 300 people an hour into this gallery safely when no one knew if it was safe? Yeah. Obviously, we did not have any interest in being the place that opened and then the next day was shut down, whether it was from a real incident or perceived incident, perceived concern. We wanted to make sure that we were doing the right thing. And this ended up being a bit of a coup from a marketing sales point of view, because it was just an awesome moment. And it was slightly prior to people converting parking lots to drive-in concerts. It was just slightly premature to that, but the twist was that we were doing it inside a building. I created a radio station within the gallery, which I had to check with the Canadian radio frequency, not the FCC, but the Canadian equivalent. Find out if that was legal or not. I did all this investigation and we were able to do that. And so we had a PA system for the sound where we had to sync that up with people could close their windows and listen to it on their car, and very interesting innovations. But ultimately we were able to open, stretch here, but I think it was end of June, ultimately 2020, right in the middle of it all. And it just went. People loved it, and what I think what people forget. Obviously, everybody was itching for something to do, but itching for something expressive and creative. And the moment that I always remember is just realizing that this was a piece of art. And this is the most important for me, is that we created for that show in particular an experience that was beyond narrative, beyond historical context. It was an expression of love for obviously one of the world's most loved artists. It was an abstract piece of music and film all around you that captured you emotionally. And yes, we spent a very large amount of money on production to make that happen, but it was all in service to this creative, piece of work, without the limitation, I guess, of it being, it must have a story, it must have all these things. And I think because it was such an emotional experience, it was successful during that pandemic, at that moment when people just needed something without being told how to feel, they just felt. And I think they needed that. I think we all needed that. And in a way, that's one of the proudest things I can say about this experience is that we built a company based on something that was an emotional piece of art at a scale that most people don't get the opportunity to do. And I'll be forever feel honored that I got to do something like that for something so purely artistic, Anyway, long story short, 6 months later, it's obviously we've sold a lot of tickets. It's very successful. The cars eventually dwindled down. We were able to walk through, and of course that was also a big success. We also had to create a way to operate, and this isn't my jam, but they had to figure out a way to operate a venue safely without, COVID hurting anybody or killing anybody. And knock on wood, we were able to do that for everybody. I don't think we heard of any incidences that were, directly related back to us. It really helped that we had some really great lobbying going on with the government. We had a lot of sign on, but it helped to establish relationships that most producers don't need to, create.
Yeah.
Back to the idea of communication with city officials, government, Ontario government officials. Without their support, we wouldn't have been able to do it. But it created a company that had the ability to realize that those people are as important to a successful event space as anybody else, and from all that learning, we decided that we're going to try and do this in the States. And so the company owners decided that Chicago was a good space for them to work because they had done some successful theater shows there. They're primarily theater producers originally. And then the search began. Got to find a space. It has to be a beautiful space. It has to be something that's going to, be a landmark for us and for the city of Chicago. Luckily, we landed on something, and so I believe we signed the lease December 2020, and started the production part of it the first week of January, and we were open with the first venue in the United States. I'm going to say it was February 10th, but it was around Valentine's Day 2021. And that just started the monster, in a way that was the opening of the floodgates, because now we had competitors.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the challenges with IP like Van Gogh, of course, is that it's open season.
Yeah.
Anyone can do something about Van Gogh because there's no exclusivity to it. And then there was all these people that wanted to do something similar. And from there it became, I guess, I always use the term an arms race. It became sort of we got to get into certain markets before the competitor does.
Yeah.
And the search for viable properties was unbelievable. It was an incredible experience, but it was also very challenging because 90% of the people that were actually saying yes to taking commercial leases on these buildings were all sitting at home at Zoom. Right? Let's build an empire from a Zoom call, and that is just it had never been done before. Again, it was another one of those.
I have a few things pulled up here that I want to share, just so everybody can kind of get a sense of exactly what you're talking about when you talk about rolling out these massive projects and dealing with competitors opening up the same thing. So I'm just going to flick over to the website here. This is the official Immersive Van Gogh website, and Lighthouse Immersive is the producer. So you see the floor, the walls, everything is very well put together. It's huge, it's giant, it completely surrounds you. And then when you I'll just pop over here. This is one of the competitors, and you can see here it just looks like kind of like maybe like a 4 by or an 8 by 16 flat with some projection on it, and then it's just kind of blocked, and there's a bunch of those in the room. There's a little bit of projection on the floor, but you can see it's not really completely immersive. So this one was another competitor, and then this one here is interesting because you can talk about the difference in the shape of the room and the gallery, going from like this giant immersive thing to this kind of scattered thing, but then the content you're projecting. What I really enjoyed about Lighthouse Immersive's take on it was it took the work and animated it in the style of Van Gogh. It wasn't really offensive to see the animations. I felt it brought you in more. It brought these paintings to life. There was one example I always tell people. It's the Cafe at Night painting, where the scene starts off and it's just kind of a close up of the building, and then like a light turns on, and then it zooms out, and you can see the entire painting now, and that window is way in the background. So like now I'm thinking, oh, there's somebody living above that cafe at night, and like, I'm thinking about that experience, and it just opens up this whole new thing. And the way that it was animated was always in the style of Van Gogh. So when you look at this video I have here, you can see, there's like Starry Night here, but then the animators, this is a competitor, this is an Immersive Van Gogh, Lighthouse Immersive, but the competitor is just like, there's a big yellow, just looks like someone threw a bucket of paint on the wall. And you can see the contrast between Starry Night in the background and then this animation here, and it doesn't feel like Van Gogh. So I think those examples there are a good example of exactly what Lighthouse Immersive has done in building these, like I said, the best, the most well put together, and the most successful shows in comparison to these competitors. And to do that, because it's really easy to throw up a couple flats and project on them, you can do that in a day or two. And with Lighthouse Immersive, you built an entire venue. You built the walls, you built it permanent, it's giant, it's massive. And to stay ahead of your competitors while taking that long to build and that much money to build is a testament to, the vision of the producers, the innovation of the production team like yourself, just to pull all this together. It's really an amazing feat. Well,
thank you.
Well, and like I don't think I've talked about it on this podcast before, but I worked under you on a few of these, and it was a very very amazing experience. It was one of the highlights of my career, and it happened through the pandemic when I wasn't working, so I'm eternally grateful that you gave me work for pretty much a solid year through that. And so talk a little bit about the creative team and their role in this, and because you worked very closely with them, and then kind of tying in the technical to, and then feeding that to like the venues that, like, say someone at my level was like on the ground, boots on the ground building. You were that kind of middleman in between creative and technical.
Yeah, I mean, the art itself, the actual animation, all comes from an amazing fellow named Massimiliano Siccardi. He's an Italian content creator. He's been working in the immersive space as long as anybody. I'm not sure. Others may make claims to that, saying they've been there longer, but he's certainly been around for a very, very long time. And he had built a team of individuals and a couple of companies that do the content rendering, all of that in Italy. I think obviously the unique vision that you're talking about what a Van Gogh immersive experience should be clearly comes from him, and I can only credit him with being very, very smart about it, and in a way having the producers just get out of the way, let him do whatever he wants. And I believe he'd had a couple of stabs at this in the past. Reading between the lines, he may not have been given the freedom that we offered him in those instances. And this isn't to criticize competitors, but I would say that the risk in some ways for this type of show is to second guess whether or not content that is that purely creative will sell tickets, whether it's good enough, whether they need more. Does the paying audience need to be sort of spoon-fed a little bit more historical context or other components? And I think the synergy between the producers and ultimately, I guess, the production people like myself, but mostly the synergy between the producers and the artist was that we are not trying to be a competitor to the Guggenheim. We're not trying to say, when you stand on a wall, you look at a piece of art and you want to know it's beautiful, but what can I learn about the art and the artist and the artist's life and those types of things? And clearly part of the attitude of an art gallery is to have written text and all these other components to it that explains why you're here paying a ticket for this beautiful piece of art. And that is not wrong by any means.
Yeah.
But it is very much the art gallery experience as we know it now. Imagine going to the Guggenheim and having nothing written about the artist.
Yeah.
That, as much as that might be an awesome experience, that's just not how it's done anymore. And I'm not saying they second guess it, but that's just so. Where we were very clear from the get-go was that we're not trying to compete with that. We're trying to give you an emotional experience.
Yeah.
And it's possible, and I'm not here to point fingers, but it is possible that some of the competitors out there kind of second guess that and said, well, we need to offer some of this historical context. We need to offer something that gives people some education and things like that. I think you can Google the things you need to Google if you're interested.
Yeah.
I know there was a degree of a program. There's some level of information you can pull from our gallery as a whole.
Yeah.
But when you're in there watching this, do you need that information to enjoy the experience?
Oh, we just lost you there. Hopefully you'll come back. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, lost you for a second there.
So so I think Lighthouse Immersive did it right in that sense, because when you are inside the gallery, it is just the art and just the visuals. And that really just lets you feel what you're gonna feel, and let's your eyes and your heart wander to take it all in. And there were some things in the lobby, like when you walk in, you'd be like, oh, this is like whatever artist you were doing. You've done more than just Van Gogh at this point now. You've done Frida and Disney. So there's like information in the lobby, but in that space, you're just surrounded by art and beauty, and music.
I think yes, of course, music too, right? I think the other thing that it is a big challenge for us as a company, but also one of the hallmarks of what makes us a company that might be different than others, is that we've chosen very pragmatically to do a show that takes into account the architecture, but isn't mapped specifically to the architecture like a 3D bit mapping type of experience. We're not animating the side of a church and making the church crumble to the ground, or all kinds of beautiful things have been done like that. And some of that work is eye-wateringly amazing. It's just so great when it's done. But one of the big challenges for us when we're looking for spaces to take over was, we want some architecture to display on, but we also don't want too much architecture. We want to have some wall space that we can really stretch out. And the thing that we wound up is that every single one of our galleries, and I mean every single one of them, is a different gallery. It is different wall dimensions, different spacing, a different walking experience from when you come into the, and I'm not talking about the lobby, I'm talking about when you go into the gallery itself. I mean, we our Los Angeles gallery is completely different than the Toronto gallery. Our New York experience was unique as well, and of course that ultimately means we're making a different film, if that's the way you want to see the show, every single time. So we backed ourselves into a artistic corner, because that is a very time-consuming and expensive process. But I think the rewards are there, because when you see, if you were to want to do a tour of our spaces, you'd have a different Van Gogh experience every single time. And That's wonderful. I think that's one of the, the things that I really think is been, and I think that, of course, there's a financial pragmatism that might push people to make other decisions in that regard.
Yeah.
I feel honored and blessed that the producers and the artistic, creator of this show thought that was the coolest thing ever. Let's just make all these new spaces. Well, then herein lies the challenge, and here we
Yeah.
are to make a new gallery with the same gear, slightly different, but
That is
you know what I mean?
definitely interesting, and it's something that I always kind of thought was a cool part of the way Lighthouse operates, was that a lot of those kind of decisions that are typically made by producers, to cut costs and just kind of get the most out of things financially. The decisions were
Mhm.
made to what's best for the show, which is like, it's not unheard of, but it's very rare, and it's very cool that Lighthouse Immersive took that approach.
Yeah. I think there's two sides to that coin. I think there's um, the other, like the one extreme of that spectrum. I will say as well is that and these aren't necessarily people that are working in exactly the same uh, immersive spaces that we are, but they are at the same time building immersive experiences. Um, and one extreme is, of course, like I think in a way we kind of fall in the middle here. One to the left, let's say, is the extreme where people are just like, well, let's just make a cookie cutter thing. Let's
Yeah.
just roll it out everywhere. Let's make it, as high as we want to make it, and it's the same everywhere. And let's, for lack of a better word, be cheap and cheerful, and then we can replicate this a million times over. Nothing wrong with that, but that's one approach. I think we fall somewhere in the middle. But I think the key difference between this and the other extreme, which is the people that are willing to spend countless amounts of money on making an experience that just simply cannot return the investment in the technology
Yeah.
or the creative. And there's a few examples out there where, I mean, when I see what they've done, and I'm like, wow, I'd love to have that kind of,
Yeah.
budget to it. But at the same time, I don't, I'm not here to market things. I'm
Yeah.
here to build stuff. But at the same time, I have to admit that I look at that as like, there is no way on earth anyone will ever pay that
Yeah.
bill for the production they put in, for the creative they put in, and with just pure ticket sales.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
that's kind of
um,
like the other end to it as well, is like, what you've done. You've managed to open up the all almost 20 venues across the U.S., with technology that is available, and
yeah, yeah,
when you get into these kind of cutting edge tech demonstrations that are like amazing to watch and amazing to be inside and see. It's just like, it it's next generation tech. It's just not able to like put on shows yet. Like, I was talking with uh you know a guy who's did the a lot of work with Our Lady Peace, and
hmm
Our Lady Peace has been Our Lady Peace is a Canadian band for anybody else outside of Canada watching. But they've kind of been on the forefront of using technology in their shows, and not only in their shows but in their production, like in their producing and selling of their albums. They're like pretty involved in Web3 and blockchain and all that kind of stuff. But
hmm
even like in partnership with Ray Kurzweil, who's very well renowned futurist, and the things they're doing. It, it's hard to do because it's the technology is so just out there and
yeah,
inaccessible. So yeah, I get what you're saying. It's you see, like, I'm sure you're kind of a tech geek like I am. You're always looking at magazines and articles about all this cool stuff, but like, is it a viable thing to put on tour or put on the road or put into a part of any show? You got to kind of
yeah.
you kind of
No,
have to
that
work with what vendors have available.
yeah. I mean, we obviously want some awesome tech. We obviously Um, so I guess there's always going to be what do we call it in retail? Loss leader, right? There's always going to be someone who puts in, some very expensive technologies because they want to be known as the most advanced, but it may not necessarily ever return on investment. We So in that sense, I think we fall in the middle because pretty much everything we've been able to build has been something that has been built on the foundation of selling tickets for it. And over a reasonable amount of time, we've been able to sort of make it viable for us.
Yeah.
Of course, I'd love to have some new Vanguard cutting edge technology, and I get to go to all the conferences now because people want to talk to me, and that's wonderful. And at some point, we'll roll out some of that.
Yeah.
My current challenge, of course, is that I'm not doing these in instances of one. I'm doing them in multiples. And so cutting edge technology is a little bit easier to swallow, even if it's at a loss, if it's an instance of one.
Yeah.
One of the challenges is, well, if I buy 20 of these, where does that set me back? And this is kind of my day-to-day problem now, which is